The Beatles, the Audiostory by Thomas Bleskin. Read by Tony Sheridan.
The 6th of July 1957 is a thoroughly pleasant day in Liverpool. It's warm, a bit too muggy perhaps, and there are just a few clouds in the sky. There is a summer fete taking place in the small suburb of Woolton, and 17-year-old Ivan Vaughan is on his way there with a mate from the neighbouring suburb of Allerton. Ivan knows the singer and guitarist from the school band who are playing this afternoon really well, from the Quarry Bank High School for Boys. His friend, younger by 2 years, has often seen the charismatic frontman but never spoken to him before. The band plays a mixture of rock and roll, folk, jazz and country, known as skiffle. Ivan Vaughan knows that his young friend is a much more accomplished guitarist than the boy on the stage. He decides to introduce them. After the performance in front of St. Peter's Parish Church, the band leader listens to the chubby-cheeked 15-year-old's guitar skills on Ivan's advice, skeptically at first, until he gives his best renditions of Eddie Cochran's 20 Flight Rock and Bebopalula by Gene Vincent, with lyrics learnt by heart. It isn't an easy decision. The band leader, a known maverick, who today is wearing a simple checked shirt in place of his customary long jacket, knows that if he asks the talented left-hander to join his band, then his days as number one are numbered. On the other hand, John Winston Lennon is sure that with someone like James Paul McCartney on board, the band will start going places. Lennon did not personally tell McCartney his decision. Pete Shotton, a member of John's band The Quarrymen, got hold of Paul around 2 weeks after the performance in Woolton while he was riding his bike. Paul thought about it for a moment and then said yes. A whole 3 months went by before they performed together, and Paul messed it up. He was so nervous that his carefully practiced guitar solo ended up wildly discordant. At this time, there were 5 members of the Quarrymen, and although the other members didn't take the band as seriously as John and Paul, it wasn't easy for George Harrison, aged just 15, to join the band. A 2.5-year age difference is no small thing for teenagers, but there were 2 things which made Paul's younger schoolmate interesting to John. Although George was a quiet sort, he had a cool teddy boy haircut, and he could play one of Lennon's favourite songs, the instrumental piece Raunchy. Although, or precisely because, performances were pretty infrequent at this time, the band was active in songwriting. They wrote original versions of songs like Love Me Do, One After 909, and When I'm 64. They even made a gramophone record which included a cover of Buddy Holly's That'll Be the Day, and a joint composition by Paul and George, In Spite of All the Danger. But things didn't look good for the Quarrymen. They flunked an audition for a TV show, and George Harrison began to play in other bands, including the Les Stewart Quartet. As chance would have it, due to a dispute with the lead singer, this band were unable to fulfill an engagement to play at the Casbah Coffee Club, a small Liverpool cellar bar. The group's bass player, Ken Brown, asked George whether he knew anyone else who could do it. From then on, the Quarrymen played at the Casbah Coffee Club every Saturday. Ken Brown also hooked up with the band, but only for 6 weeks. Brown was angry with Paul for not paying him his fee after he missed a concert with a cold. The setbacks piled up. Another TV audition fell flat because the musicians couldn't afford to stay overnight in Manchester. Before the public could determine the winner of the evening audition with the strength of their applause, Johnny and the Moondogs, as the band was then called, were sitting on the last train to Liverpool. 1959 drew to a close, and any other teenage combo in the same situation might have given up, but not John Lennon, Paul McCartney, and George Harrison. 1960 began with an important new opening for the Quarrymen. Stuart Ferguson Victor Sutcliffe was a close friend of John Lennon from art college. Stuart was a budding artist, but he was equally keen on a musical career. Although an unskilled and untalented musician, he became the Quarrymen's new bass player. John persuaded him to get himself a Hofner President guitar, which he did with the proceeds from one of his paintings, which had just sold for the princely sum of £65. As a person, Stu was a real addition to the band, and he hardly interfered with their music, as he often turned his back to the crowd while on stage, so that no one noticed that he only ever plucked mechanically at the fat strings with one finger. And Stuart Sutcliffe had one not entirely unimportant idea. He suggested a new name for the group, Beatles, spelled B-E-A-T-A-L-S. Alan Williams got to know the foursome in his cafe Jacaranda, where they sometimes had espressos. The powerfully built 29-year-old decided to wangle some gigs for the band every now and then. The Beatles historian Mark Lewison refers to Williams as a quasi-manager. And he did some good work. He managed to get the Beatles an audition with Larry Parnes, a concert organizer from London, who was looking for support bands for his solo artists. But John, Paul, George and Stuart was still missing a drummer. The drummer, Tommy Moore, was somewhat older than the four Beatles, but at least thanks to Williams, the band had now someone to set the rhythm. Then there were problems with the band's name, which no one except for the Beatles really liked. Long John and the Silver Beatles was one suggestion, but Lennon refused to be called Long John. The group changed the spelling of their name to Beatles, spelt with a double E, like the insects. The audition to play with Pound's singing wonder Billy Fury was a disaster. Tommy Moore, the new man on the drums, arrived too late. His replacement, Johnny Hutchinson, from the competing band Cass and the Casanovas, saw it as a chore and accordingly came across as bored. When Tommy Moore finally did arrive in time to accompany the remaining couple of songs, it was already obvious to those taking part that the new job as backing band for the great Billy Fury was long gone. But Pounds had some more cards up his sleeve, one of which related to the artist Johnny Gentle. The Silver Beatles were to do a small tour with him in the northeast of England and Scotland. John Lennon and Sutcliffe gave up their studies straight away. George Harrison and Tommy Moore took time off work. Only Paul had to do some persuading to get his father to agree to let him go. The way into glamorous show business was finally open. At least that was what the band thought. But the tour turned into a near catastrophe. The organizers were so bad at paying that the group could not even afford regular meals. And then Johnny Gentle had an accident at the wheel of the tour bus, in which Tommy Moore lost a few teeth and had to be admitted to hospital. Back in Liverpool, the five were totally disillusioned as far as show business was concerned. Although Alan Williams let the band play in his club on Mondays in exchange for a small dinner and arranged a few other little performances, Tommy Moore and his girlfriend in particular had had enough of rock and roll. Tommy left the band and they were without a drummer again. In spite of a few gigs which the Silver Beats played at the Grosvenor Ballroom with Jerry and the Pacemakers, the low point for the band, again reduced to a foursome, came in the form of Janice. The stripper hired the band to provide background music for her strip routine. A temp drummer called Norman Chapman stayed for 3 whole gigs until he was called up for military service. That was also on the cards for Lennon, McCartney, Harrison and Sutcliffe. But then came Hamburg. "You must come over here to Hamburg and bring a few bands to play here," read a letter which Alan Williams received from Germany in June. The letter was sent by the Royal Caribbean Steel Band, who used to be regulars in his bar, Jacaranda. Williams smelt money and went over. In his luggage was an audio tape with recordings of his bands: the Silver Beatles, Jerry and the Pacemakers, Cass and the Casanovas, and others. But the tape was blank. When Williams wanted to play it to Bruno Koschmider, who ran the Kaiserkeller nightclub in Hamburg, there was nothing there except white noise. The tape must have been demagnetized somewhere. Disappointed, Williams left and went back to Liverpool. It was pure chance that Williams and Koschmider bumped into one another again in the Two Eyes Coffee Bar in London. Koschmider, impressed by the spectacular failure of Williams' introduction a few weeks earlier, wanted to hear the English wonder bands for himself and mistakenly travelled to London instead of Liverpool. He took on Derry and the Seniors, who went on stage in the Kaiserkeller at the end of July 1960. But Koschmider wanted more new English bands in the North German harbour metropolis, and Williams was on the verge of sending the Silver Beatles, provided that they finally found themselves a permanent drummer. They didn't have to look for long before running into Randolph Peter Best in the Casbah Coffee Club. He had a brand new drum set and was planning a career as a professional drummer. When Pete Best answered yes to the question of whether he wanted to join the Silver Beatles, the band had everything they needed to travel to Hamburg 4 days later. They left for Germany on the 16th of August in Alan Williams' green Austin van. They were now called the Beatles. The Kaiserkeller, located at 36 Große Freiheit in the St. Pauli quarter of Hamburg, was a respectable place. But the Beatles did not play there. Koschmider wanted the band to play at his second club, a former strip joint called Indra. John, Paul, George, Stuart and Pete's accommodation was as dingy as the place where they were performing. When their performances at Indra were over, which lasted between 4.5 to 6 hours, they slept in the almost derelict back room of the Bambi Cinema. They washed in the visitors' toilets. The Indra Club didn't last long. The locals were used to the traditional nighttime entertainment and not loud, energetic beat music. The police intervened and the Beatles were told to play more quietly, and then still more quietly. But as the historian Mark Lewison so aptly observes, Long Tall Sally was simply not written for whispering. Koschmider had to close the Indra after 48 days, but for the Liverpool Quintet, this was the next step upwards. From the beginning of October 1960, the Beatles played at the Kaiserkeller. The big stage at the new club, which seemed huge in comparison to those at their earlier venues, annoyed the band. Alan Williams couldn't bear the way his boys just stood there, as though they didn't have anywhere to go, almost like they'd taken root. "Make a show, boys," he called to them, and Bruno Koschmider and his men echoed him. The Beatles, and John Lennon in particular, were only too pleased by this request. John began to jump around like a crazy man. All this stage show had the effect of making the not always loyal Hamburg public eager for more from the Beatles. On the 15th of October 1960, a fateful meeting took place. After the contract had expired for Derry and the Seniors, who had been playing at the Kaiserkeller, Koschmider had brought Rory Storm and the Hurricanes to Hamburg. And that day, John, Paul and George met two members of that band in a small Hamburg studio to record a version of a George Gershwin classic, Summertime. Pete Best didn't go, and so it came about that the Hurricanes drummer took a seat at the drums. For the very first time, the Beatles played with Richard Starkey, whose stage name was Ringo Starr. Although the four got on really well, there was no reason for Ringo to leave the Hurricanes. especially as the Beatles were on the brink of their next crisis. At the end of October, a new club opened on the Reeperbahn. The top